Hi, everyone. This is the video that goes along with chapters 7 and 8 on the biological bases of personality. We've said at the beginning of the semester that the main two areas of research or current research in personality psychology are trait theory and biological bases of personality. So we're getting to the second of those. When you start out with chapter 7, it's a broad review of almost everything that you learned about the brain in introductory psychology. Skim over that, especially if it's been a while since you took introductory psychology, sort of understanding the electrochemical nature of transmission in the brain, how neurotransmitters float across the synapse between neurons, but that there's an electrical signal within the neuron. You've got trillions of neurons, and so it's astonishing that they can all communicate with each other at the time that they need to, in the way that they need to, and not in ways that they don't need to. So just sort of take that as a high-level review. If you'll look at the study guide that's posted in the exams and study guides folder, you'll see what areas of the brain I'd like you to sort of maybe take notes on or be aware of for the next test. But it's certainly not everything having to do with every part of the brain and every function there. When it talks about brain research and what we know, some of what we know about the brain is based on natural experiments. There's an accident, there's a disease, there's something that we know that has happened that's negative. We wouldn't do that intentionally to a human animal, but because it's happened, we can learn what happened, perhaps where in the brain it happened, and then what the outcome was, and in particular, for this course, what the impact was on personality. So there's some really famous cases there, but there are a lot of not so famous cases. Very often, if a person is going to have brain surgery for something like having deep brain stimulation, the electrodes implanted in the brain, that might be a last resort for treatment of depression, or it might be a treatment for Parkinson's that's not responding to other drugs, or for whatever reason. I think that the field is moving forward. So it used to be that you would try everything else and then do DBS at the end. And I think increasingly, as they understand deep brain stimulation better, it might not actually be the very last resort. Anyway, uh, when you're undergoing that surgery, the person is awake because they need to be awake so that the brain surgeon can touch different parts of the brain and make sure that they are operating on the part of the brain that matters and not the part of the brain that they're not intending to. And this is true for DBS or for other forms of brain surgery. Sometimes what they'll do is ask the patient, would you like to participate in some research? And so they might be asked other questions having to do with personality research. And so we've learned things in that way. fMRI research, I think, there's been a decently long history of it. There are changes in the statistical analysis of that have rendered some of the early research harder to interpret. But with the more recent research, active areas of the brain can tell us something about what the person is thinking, what the function of that area of the brain might be. But increasingly what we're finding is there's so much plasticity in the brain, there's so much overlap in the brain, that it's really hard to say that this area and only this area has this function. And so sort of keep that in mind. 5 years from now or 10 years from now, you will look back on what you remember from the brain from this chapter and say, some of that was wrong. And that will be right, because that will be true, because we are continually learning more and more about the brain and how it works. There's a book called Descartes' Error by Antonio Damasio. The reference to it is at the end of the chapter. But it's a really interesting book because you think about, if your brain stops working, or if your brain stops working in the way that it does today, are you still you? And what we have found is when there are drastic brain injuries, it can drastically change your personality. If you had a brain implant, if that were possible, it's not, into somebody else's body, is it the person who's got that face and that fingerprint, or is it the person who's got that brain and that personality? And most people would say it's the brain and the personality, but trying to think about those two things together, Damasio thought that Descartes got it wrong when he said that there were two separate things, that there was the physiological brain and then there was something else. And I'll leave that to you or to other experts in philosophy and other areas of study. Then when you get to the next chapter, behavioral genetics and evolutionary psychology, for behavioral genetics, a lot of what we know is based on twin and adoption studies. And so you can take identical twins who are raised in the same home, share 100% of their DNA, and compare them with identical twins, share 100% of their DNA, but they were raised in different homes. They were adopted into different homes. You can do the same thing with dizygotic twins who, on average, share 50% of their DNA. Some of them raised together, some of them raised apart, and compare those levels of similarity. And so the idea is to find out how much of our personality is subject to genetic inheritance. The statistical calculation that they use for that is heritability. And the reason that I would like to focus on heritability here is for the rest of your life, you're going to be reading research. It's like researchers have found that such and such is inherited. Researchers found that this other thing is inherited. And that will be true. But when you read the article, what they will say is they found a heritability coefficient of 0.2 or 0.3 or 0.4. And what that means is that's the percentage of the variance in an entire population that could be attributed to genes. So if you think about for personality, and this is discussed in the book, many of the correlations are around 0.4. So what that is saying is that about 40% of the variability in some aspect of personality can be explained by genes, but not all of it, right? So your extroversion doesn't go from 0 to 100. Like I don't know anybody who's completely introverted because we would have never met them. They've never come out of their home. I don't know anybody who's completely extroverted. I wouldn't want to know that person. But most people are sort of in a sort of center range, and there's variability within that range. And so 40% of that variability is the heritability coefficient. And then further, it's in a population. So we can't tell for any specific person how much of their personality or the variability in their personality on that trait is attributed to their genes, but we know there's some. And so it's getting us part of the way we're learning more and more about it. Genes matter. They matter a lot more than we used to think they did. We used to think, the behaviorists or the strict behaviorists used to think that if you took a child the day that they were born and dropped them into any family, the way that they turned out as an adult, the way you turned out, is a function of the environment that you were raised in. And what we're coming to understand increasingly is that's not true. If you take somebody and drop them into a family, into an adoptive family, as an adult, they will be more like, on many personality variables, they will be more like their biological parents than their adoptive parents, even if they've never met their biological parents. So there's a strong genetic component. Biology is not our destiny, but it does have an impact on the development of our personality over our lifespan. So in behavioral genetics, they look at the genetic component. So they're comparing, are they identical twins? Are they dizygotic twins? Are they siblings that are of different ages raised in the same family who on average also share about 50% of their DNA? Or are they adoptive children who share none of their DNA with their adoptive parents? And then how much are they like their adoptive parents? So there's the genetic component, there's the shared environment, and everything that happens within the home is assumed to be a shared environment. Everything that happens outside the home, say at school or in clubs or in sports, is a non-shared environment. In other words, the two children did not share that environment. And then the rest of it is sort of attributed to error, which is not insignificant. When you think about a shared environment, think about growing up, if you did, with a sibling, and you and your sibling having a different recollection of how something happened in your family or what a rule was in your family. Because of your personality, you experienced that event, that family environment differently. So if you were a relatively introverted child, then when your parents were arguing, that was pretty upsetting to you and you might remember it a lot. If you were a pretty extroverted child, when your parents were arguing, you might not have noticed it that much. It didn't bother you that much. And so it wasn't really part of, an enduring memory for you in a sort of broad spectrum way. So the shared environment isn't 100% shared. And some scientists would say there's no such thing as a shared environment because it depends on the person. So I'll leave that up to you to think about or to think about more as you study more in personality. But it turns out based on research that parents matter, that family home matters, but a lot less than we used to think. And what happens in the non-shared environment where coincidentally, children spend most of their time from the time that they enter kindergarten. They probably spend more time outside of the home than inside the home because they're in school or they're in after school activities and some combination of those things. So parents matter, but a lot less than we used to think they did. And then there's the field of epigenetics, which studies the extent to which you might have the gene for something, but certain circumstances would either turn that on or off. So there's a gene associated with emotional, angry emotionality. And if you have that gene, or if you have a certain form of that gene, and you were maltreated as a child, you have one trajectory. And if you have that gene and you were not maltreated as a child, you have a different trajectory. So epigenetics is the idea that just because you have the gene doesn't necessarily mean that the gene is active. It may not be active ever, or it may be active at some portion of the lifespan, but not the whole lifespan. The book talks about those in-person environment transactions. So evocative, the extent to which you draw things out of people and you create a situation because of that. Active, where you actively seek out things that are consistent with your personality. And then reactive, where things happen and you have a particular reaction to them because of your genetic inheritance. Perhaps your level of trait anxiety would cause you to, again, experience discord in the family in one way, depending on whether you had high anxiety or low anxiety. And then evolutionary psychology. One of the criticisms there is that they are sort of just so stories. We take what we see currently and then try and imagine how that might have evolved. And there are different ways of imagining that. And so it's hard to prove it because if you're going back, thousands of years or, even more than that, we can't do scientific research back then. And so we're making something up, we're making a conjecture. So does that explain why we mate, why we choose the mates that we do, why some people don't mate, why some people are depressed, why some people are not depressed. There are all kinds of things where you could think about adaptive fitness or the lack of adaptive fitness in the evolution of particular personality traits or variables. So think about that, and again, think about the fact that biology is not your destiny, but there are biological bases of personality that come into play. So again, sort of last plug for the study guide. Take a look at both chapters 7 and 8 to see what things you might want to focus on, maybe before you read those chapters, so that you can spend. I recommend reading them all at a high level, the entire chapter, but then focusing in only on things maybe that we're going to need for this course. So if you've got any questions, let me know. Otherwise, have a great week. Thanks. Bye.